very much welcome. You could see by the applause that you are awaited and that you have a group of people in Sweden who know you very well. Welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. You are a long-time friend of Sweden, as Sweden is a friend of Palestine and its fate. You're here in Stockholm for an event with our sister institute, SIPRI, yes, on peace and development, discussing tough global issues. You saw the foreign minister today, and now you are here with us. There are some people from the young generation who should hear, however, something of where you're coming from. You come from Nablus. You come from...
Actually, no.
That's what it says.
It says, you don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia.
See?
I have a Jerusalem ID. I come from a family that belongs to the clans of Ramallah, and I was born in Nablus. Accidentally, my father was a doctor there for 2 years, so yeah, that's the extent.
But you are a professor in English literature.
Yes, I am.
And this has to do with something who you are. And but in Sweden, you rose to prominence during the years before the Oslo Accord. You were the spokesperson. Indelibly, you made a mark in global awareness and certainly in Swedish awareness. You went on to become Minister of Higher Education. You resigned. There are many issues to face in a political life. You went on, of course, to be influential in the global world, in UN institutions, even in the World Bank, I believe, and certainly in other areas. You were awarded the Olof Palme Peace Prize in 2003, 2, something like this.
Yeah, Anna Lindh gave it to me.
Yes.
And she made a wonderful speech, yes, and we miss her dearly.
We miss her as we miss leaders. You once said, I'm a Palestinian, I'm a woman, I'm an activist and a humanist, more than a politician. But please, we do need political leadership today. Please guide us to the next steps in how we should handle this difficult world and the fate for your nation.
Thank you.
Hanan Ashrawi, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please.
You want me to speak?
Yes.
Okay. Right, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you all for coming, and I hope that this is more of an intimate sort of interactive exchange of ideas rather than a
There's
lecture.
a chair behind you if you want to.
When I get tired, I will sit down. Actually, the title that you suggested was very interesting because you said Palestine at the Crossroads. And this is entirely true. This year we are marking 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 70 years since the partition of Palestine, 50 years since the occupation of the rest of Palestine in 1967. And I add to it another number, 0 years for the two-state solution, unless there is a real effective engagement, global engagement. We are witnessing the end of the mantra of the two-state solution that has allowed Israel to act unilaterally, to build more settlements, to steal more land, to create facts on the ground, and then to continue talking about two states as though just the mention of two states is enough, while there is no accountability for Israel, no curbs, no intervention to stop these actions that are destroying the very foundations of peace and that are destroying actually the objective of any peace talks, which is the sharing of the land of Palestine. We accepted Israel on 78% of historical Palestine, and now Israel doesn't even want to relinquish the remaining 22%, and we are witnessing the last stages of the superimposition of Greater Israel on historical Palestine, on all of Palestine. As some people said, this is the continuation of fundamentalist Zionism that began in 1948 to displace and replace a whole nation. And Palestinians feel, especially among the young, that they do not see any horizon for peace. They do not see any genuine engagement. And given the nature of the global conditions and situation these days, it's even more difficult to look outwards and hope that there will be a global rule of law and a real commitment for peace. I must say, among the few countries that have really put their money where their mouth is, literally, politically, and metaphorically, is Sweden, because it's the one country that recognized Palestine. Doesn't just say, I want a two-state solution, it does something about it. It is also one country that has engaged us positively in institution building, in nation building, but also in achieving a system of good governance with institutions that are accountable, that are transparent, and that are efficient. And we are not just glad for that, but it continues a very long history of engagement with Palestine. You mentioned this, Mats, when we started. It dates back, I said this morning, to the days in the UN of Count Bernadotte, for example, to Dag Hammarskjöld, to Olof Palme, to Sten Anderson, to Anna Lindh, to many others. And now you have a wonderful feminist foreign minister who is also courageous to speak out and to speak truth to power and to act on principle. We are extremely happy with this relationship, and we thank you for your vote and for your recognition. But unfortunately, the same cannot be said of the rest of the world. We are seeing now, witnessing a convergence or a confluence of several adverse factors that are not conducive to peace or a just solution. The first, you are seeing within Israel one of the most right-wing, hardline, racist, militaristic coalitions in history, in the history of Israel. It's a government that has legitimized exclusivity and exclusion. In many ways, the discourse of fascism, the total devaluation of Palestinian rights and lives. It has a free hand without any kind of accountability. So the first aspect of this government in Israel is impunity. Israel feels that it can act outside the law, and there is no accountability, there is no intervention. And on the contrary, there is actually protection for Israel, whether it's from the US or other countries. And the latest elections in the US and the Brexit and the emergence of populism in Europe and in the States primarily, and the very overt language of racism, misogyny, again, exclusion, populism, Islamophobia, and so on. This has emboldened Netanyahu and his coalition. And he feels justified that to represent himself as fighting the forces of darkness and terrorism, while he stands on the side of right and light and so on. And the myths that are being propagated are exactly in that vein, attempting to distort and create a fraudulent narrative to dehumanize and demonize the Palestinians and to justify whatever this Israeli government wants to do. So this impunity also has had an impact on other places in the world, because if you do not guarantee the applicability of the law, the global rule of law, to different states, if certain states have preferential treatment and so on, then others will feel, why not? I mean, we can violate international law and international humanitarian law as well. It sets an example, number one. But number two, with Israel having such preferential treatment, it generated a sense of entitlement, a sense of exceptionalism, that we can get away with everything. And not just against the Palestinians, but against even Israeli organizations, particularly human rights organizations, like B'Tselem, like Breaking the Silence, and so on. Courageous people within Israel who are speaking out and who are challenging the prevailing discourse within Israel and mindset. And they themselves have been targeted in the same way as we have been targeted. And they have legislated against them. Not only that, but Netanyahu tries to incite other countries, other governments, to punish his own people. You know what happened with the German foreign minister and others. So that kind of language also, and sense of being untouchable and with preferential treatment and privileged treatment and so on, and exceptionalism, has created a real sense of racism within Israel. That we can continue to enslave a whole nation, to hold them captive, to do whatever we want to them, because we are entitled, because nobody tells us not to. Even when people say it verbally, they don't follow the language aspect with any kind of action to show that there is a price to be paid. And so long as this occupation is not only an occupation with impunity, but it's an occupation that is profitable and without any price to be paid, then they will continue. Why should they stop? People talk about two states. The occupation is illegal, it's cruel, it's immoral, and so on, but it is allowed to continue. And that has led to this internally ethos within Israel that is bordering on fascist. Some people say it has become actually really fascist. And this kind of racism and so on is also an outcome of a militaristic approach to reality. Military superiority, military domination, military control. Israel is the largest trader in weapons and arms. It enjoys, again, the transfer of knowledge, of technology, and of funds from the US, and has continued as, actually it has a whole captive population to try its weapons on. That, again, has led to a definition of security, we talked about this morning, in military terms. That Israel's security, the great God's security, belongs to Israel, and Israel defines it in military terms, controlling the Palestinians, stealing their land on the basis of security. Israel's security is paramount. The Palestinians have no security whatsoever, whether in terms of our geography or territory, whether in terms of our history, our culture, our identity, our rights, our institutions, our future, let alone our economy and our infrastructure or our resources. Israel can steal those and can change the narrative, actually. We're witnessing a real new narrative emerging that has very little to do with reality. And our history has been, in many ways, distorted, our culture confiscated and changed. So that is another aspect. But the fourth characteristic I can talk about is the emergence of the language of ideology and religion in terms of attempting to define the conflict as a conflict between religions or as a religious conflict by targeting holy sites that are holy to Muslims and Christians and so on. It's attempting to portray this as a conflict between or among religions rather than as a man-made conflict. And therefore, again, a woman is needed to solve it. Women maybe should solve it. And therefore, it has to be solved on the basis of legality and by political and moral means rather than by military means. But every approach that Israel has had to any solution has always been based on military control. They want demilitarized Palestine. They don't even want Palestine, Palestinian communities and population centers, but maintaining Israeli troops, maintaining Israeli control, crossing points, airspace, territorial waters, land borders, and so on. So Israel is attempting to perpetuate the very reasons for the violence and instability and conflict under the claim that this is how its security is served. If you think that stealing other people's lands and resources will give you security, then it means Israel will never be secure, because it will have to continue beyond Palestine into Jordan, beyond Jordan into Iraq, because, the more land you steal, the more a situation of insecurity do you create. And to solve it, you need to take more land. This is not the age of cavalry and sort of horses or infantry. And this is the age where security is guaranteed. First of all, it has to be guaranteed by a just peace, by being an accountable country living in peace in the neighborhood. And second of all, you know that you don't need to steal land to say I'm secure. You need to be able, if you, in the 21st century, modern technology and modern weaponry certainly has made land acquisition not a necessary prerequisite. And the third aspect is that security can never be a prerequisite for peace. It's the other way around. Only a just peace produces security. So here we are with this government, with this condition in Israel, where even the peace camp has almost disappeared. It has been silenced, intimidated. The opposition that used to be a long time ago, when Sten was working with us on starting a peace process, it was vocal and presented itself as the antidote to the extreme right. Now it's being co-opted, and in many ways it is a diluted version of the extreme right. Only people like, very few organizations are active, and Meretz probably, Zahava Galon is still quite a woman of principle, and a few others. But the whole terrain, the whole political terrain, and the public domain is shifting to the right, to the more extreme right even, and attempting to marginalize and to disenfranchise those who question these very dangerous and lethal policies of the occupation. But add to that what's happening in the rest of the world. I don't want to speak. I promised I don't want to lecture, but I am lecturing. So this context is not good for peace. We need serious engagement and intervention, and we need respect for international law and international humanitarian law. And we need countries to be, and people to be treated as equals. You do not have one country that is exempt from respect for the law and human rights, and one country that is, one nation or people that are deprived of the protection of the law, which is the Palestinians.
Thank you. Let me pose a few questions, and then I'll open up to the audience. Today, the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas is in Washington to see Trump. Trump started off saying he's the master of deals and he wants a big deal for peace. He starts by saying he'll move the embassy to Jerusalem, appoints an ambassador who makes his first objective to insult the Israeli peace movement. And what can we now expect? Dennis Ross, I'm sure you know since many years, says seldom, if ever, have the prospects been as bad as they are today. Yet Mahmoud Abbas is in Washington today.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, actually an invitation to Washington is something that's very difficult to decline, as you know, regardless. And if you're in a position of Mahmoud Abbas, you certainly cannot say no to the American president, regardless of his the nature of his administration or his ideology, or lack of. He's not an ideological person, Trump, is he? No, nobody knows what he will do next, and I'm sure you share with me the one predictable thing about him is that he's unpredictable. So, look, there are different schools of thought in Palestine, very frankly. There are those who think that the Americans hold the cards, they're powerful, and therefore we need to be on the good side of the Americans all the time. There are those who believe, no, that you have to stand up to the Americans and tell them where they've gone wrong, and that by siding with Israel blindly, by becoming complicit in the occupation, this is really destructive. Not just for the chances of peace, but for the region as a whole, and also for the standing and credibility and influence of the U.S. And there were even some American generals who said that, including Mattis, General Mattis, who said that the security of our own troops in the region is being undermined by what Israel does, because we are giving Israel cover, protection, and support to do this. Anyway, so nobody is really that naive to expect something dramatic to emerge now from President Trump. Some people say he's pragmatic. Okay, he wants to make a deal, the ultimate deal, but he doesn't define it. In a very sort of lackadaisical way, he says 1 state, 2 states, whatever you want, I'll agree. Or I don't know why there isn't a deal anymore. That it's very easy that this conflict be solved. There can be a deal. So with that kind of attitude, this is not a business transaction. This is more than just negotiations over interests and trade or private sector enterprises. This has a lot to do with the complexity of history, of identity, of culture, of survival even. It's a matter really of survival for the Palestinians, and it's a matter of witnessing firsthand the whole nation being made to, being negated and almost disappear from contemporary history. And the Palestinians are a very tenacious people. We don't give up easily. We stay on the land and we struggle. So if you want to believe that he's a pragmatist and he wants to make the ultimate deal, we also look at the team that he has in place. Who's in charge of, sort of the peacemaking in the White House, not in the State Department, is Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, whose family foundation has been supporting settlements all these years, and who has supported himself settlements, and who has paid, and who is also a business partner of a bank in Israel and of a major Israeli businessman. So if this is in conflict of interest, I don't know what. And if it is not, sort of being part of the problem rather than of the solution, I don't know. I don't know if he will have an epiphany and change and decide he wants to make peace, but it's hard to see that. When you appoint an ambassador like Friedman, who also supports the settlement Beit Il, which is within walking distance from my office, from my home, and also had gotten money from Trump to support that settlement. So when you support settlements, then you are part of an illegal act. Settlements are a war crime, aren't they? According to the, not just the Fourth Geneva Convention, but also the Rome Statute of the ICC. Moving your own population onto occupied territory is a war crime. And then you have also Greenblatt. Well, you have a white supremacist also in the White House, like Steve Bannon. And I don't know how somebody with that ideology can work towards peace when we have also been negated in the discourse of racism and exclusion. With Greenblatt, who's now his envoy, he said openly he's learning. He's on a learning curve. He doesn't know. He didn't know. None of these people know Palestinians. They haven't met us. They don't know who we are. So they know the Israelis very well. He has an apartment in Jerusalem, Greenblatt. He's funded settlements, Friedman, and so on. But Greenblatt is beginning, he said, to learn, to understand. So is this too little, too late? Would he really understand? Can you change your policy orientations or your biases? Because in order to make peace, you have to be an even-handed peace broker. Now, more open administrations, I remember I said this in Sweden as well. I'm committing the sin of quoting myself. I said, by no stretch of the imagination can you ever accuse the Americans of being even-handed in peacemaking. So they're not an even-handed peace broker. But now the questions, are multiplied. We don't know. And if anybody tells you that he or she has the sure answer as to how this administration is going to act, beyond their absolute commitment to Israel, maybe they'll be motivated by trying to save Israel from itself? We don't know. But we have to wait and see. Now, Israel is shaping the agenda by saying the Palestinians have to stop supporting the prisoners. The Palestinians have to stop incitement and violence, as though, the provocations of the Israeli occupation are not enough. Every time there are people there's a new way of dealing with reality, Israel says, look, there's something shiny out there, in order not to deal with the real issue. Which is what Trump does. Every time there's a scandal, he points to something else. Now, that's what Israel is doing, putting preconditions. The problem is that the Palestinians don't want to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Well, who recognizes religions for states anyway? And this is not a religious conflict either. So every time somebody tries to move, he manages to create more and more obstacles, more and more preconditions, in order to prevent any kind of genuine handling of the issues. So it's not the occupation to them, it's everything that the Palestinians do. And in many cases, it's the mere fact of our existence that is very difficult for Trump and his ilk to appreciate. Now, just one, the fact that Trump has backtracked on the issue of moving the embassy for a while. We don't know if he will do it again. Now Israel is leaking that he will move the embassy, but we haven't heard this from the Americans. If the American embassy moves to Jerusalem, that's it. You close the door on any kind of solution or any kind of role. But he has backtracked or put that off for a while. The fact that he told Netanyahu to just hold off on settlements for a while. That is something that Netanyahu certainly didn't expect, because he thought he had, as we say, a carte blanche, an open check. You can do whatever you want, and the Americans will not in any way hold you accountable. So you get little acts here and there. You get commitments that get nullified or changed the next day. But one thing he said is that he wants to make a deal. And he wants to make the ultimate deal. So rather than say no, the president now, Mahmoud Abbas, is in Washington. Today he will have a meeting with Trump, and we will see what are the components of that deal, and then we will talk about it, after talking about it for so long.
Surely we are desperate for leadership. There used to be some in Europe, and Oslo and Madrid, and they were meaningful.
Yes.
Now look at us. Brexit, rightist populists. Europe is not where it was, but could it come back? What do you expect from Europe? What do you advise Europe? Yeah. Sweden has recognized Palestine. Yes. There are always politics going on. The latest, something in UNESCO you might want to share with people. But it goes on and on. What can we do from Europe?
Yeah. Well, actually, we had always looked towards Europe for a different discourse, because European policies have always been different from American policies. As our next-door regional neighbor, as people who have had contacts with the region, they weren't just exploring, they knew the realities. And so we always expected Europe to chart its own course. And unfortunately, we always have to be more European than the Europeans. We keep telling them, you have strength, you can use it, you can use your relations, you can use your special economic ties with Israel and so on. Because you cannot just sign checks for nation building if you are not part of the political process and you do not hold Israel to account.
The Paris conference?
Yes. Now, the Paris conference, well, before Paris conference, let me say that within the quartet, which is a very strange creature, Europe was relegated to the role of another player within an American-devised construct, and the US called the shots. We kept saying, no, we need Europe to have its own voice, its own policies, its own say. And in the division of labor, you cannot have a US monopoly on politics and peacemaking and tell the Europeans you sign the checks of nation building and institution building. That was the wrong approach. Those who sign the checks have to have power also to ensure that there is a political process that leads somewhere. Europe has changed, as you said, yes. The Paris conference, we're glad that it took place. We encouraged it, we supported it, but Israel has rejected it. We were actually disinvited because Israel refused to go. So they held it without either party. And some countries refused to have even that statement be taken into the UN or be followed up on issues of practical import. We don't know yet. Now, France is undergoing elections. The voices of populism and extremism and right-wing policies are emerging, not just in France and not just as a result of Brexit. There are lots of complex issues in this dynamic. As you know, I don't want to talk about the issue of internal violence and terrorism and the issue of the asylum seekers and refugees and migrants and whatever you want to call them, and the fact that this has been exploited in many ways to raise fears and to justify extremist exclusionary politics, which are very dangerous. Europe now is turning inward in the same way as the region is turning inward, although there are many proxy wars in the Arab world, particularly in Syria, in Yemen. You have problems in Libya, you have Iraq. So there are all these problems that have taken over the attention. In Europe, you have, again, a serious transformation and a challenge to everything that Europe stood for in terms of human rights and global justice and positive engagement in the world. And Sweden is one of the few exceptions, really, within Europe that has taken a firm stance, a position of principle that is consistent with its values. And this morning I said, people are saying that there's this country sitting there, this Nordic country up north there. What is it doing? Engaging with the world, meddling in the world. And I kept saying, thank heavens that there is such a country who hasn't closed itself in and who feels the responsibility of intervention and engagement in a positive way. So I don't expect to see real changes now or a real bold policy. Within Europe, you also have the American wannabes. You have certain countries that are trying to imitate the US and US policies and are trying to prove that to the US that they are more Trump than Trump himself. Then there are those who say, let us resolve our own domestic issues. And there are those who believe that Israel is right. Or there are those who are riddled with guilt, and who feel that we cannot criticize Israel because we've been we have such a horrible history with the Jews of Europe and so on. But regardless of the motive, we are in an interrelated, connected world. Nobody, country or region, can shut itself in and isolate itself the way the US seems to think by saying America first, we can shut the world out. Mm-hmm. You cannot. And so the world has a way of intruding, and conflicts have a way of intruding, and you have a ripple effect throughout.
But can I ask you about the two-state solution itself? Mm-hmm. With the lack of progress that's been happening, people are turning to other tracks of logic. And even if we go back, if we remember Edward Said, who always said, the only just solution would be a one-state solution. It's the only moral and ultimately sustainable one. We tried the two-state solution. It's not happening. Even Palestinians are perhaps turning away from the hope. What do you say to that kind of questioning of the fundamentals of what we were trying to achieve diplomatically over all these years?
Yeah, I think once we reached a global consensus on the two-state solution, Israel is on the verge of destroying it. So it's very ironic that it took us all these years to persuade people that Palestinians have the right to self-determination, to freedom, to dignity on their own land, and they accepted this, and some of you, thank heavens, recognized us as a state, even albeit under occupation. Now Israel is saying no, that it wants to superimpose Greater Israel on all of historical Palestine. This is a recipe for disaster, really, because there are many people who are saying if you are talking about one state, the way Israel envisages the state, as though we are just population centers, under Israeli sovereignty and control. And if you're talking about the perpetuation of the occupation and land theft and so on, demolition of homes, theft of IDs, collective incarceration and imprisonment and so on, then you are just perpetuating an injustice. You're not creating a one-state solution. You're creating a situation that is worse than apartheid. It's worse than apartheid because you're attempting, again, to eradicate a whole nation in terms of its rights, in terms of its self-determination, freedom, and so on. And if we start talking about that kind of situation, then it is a disaster. It's a de facto one state, but it is based on maintaining the occupation and Israel's stranglehold and giving Israel a free hand to do what it wants to the Palestinians. And certainly I do not believe in the demographic argument. I'm sure you've heard this. And this is one way in which many friends of Israel are scaring Israel by saying if you keep controlling the Palestinians, you cannot have the land without the people, and the Palestinians will have more babies and more children, and then demographically there will be more than you, and so on. So you cannot preserve the purity of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, or they will have greater population numbers. I think this kind of reasoning in many ways is playing into Israeli reasoning. I do not see ourselves as a demographic danger to Israel. I see ourselves as a people, a nation with rights. We deserve our right to live on our own land in freedom and so on. We don't want to live under occupation, number one. Number two, I don't think that any state should define its right to maintain its own purity, whether religious or ethnic purity, and claim superior value to a certain group of people over others by virtue of religious affiliation or ethnicity or what, for any reason whatsoever. A state has to be democratic, has to be inclusive, has to be a state for all its citizens. Only in Israel do you have a state that claims the only people who deserve equality and real citizenship are those who happen to be Jewish. And then we are described as the non-Jewish communities, as in the Balfour Declaration, even though we were historically the majority Christians and Muslims in Palestine. But we became just the non-Jewish communities in the sense that we became a secondary. So the other one-state solution is the idealistic one, not the real one that is being created, the dangerous one that's being created by the occupation, but one which was proposed by the Palestinians. I know some of you have gray hair like me. I'm sure you remember in 68, 69, we proposed the one state, one democratic, non-sectarian, secular state, where all faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jew, and I add atheist and Buddhist and whatever you want, can live in peace in Palestine as equals. This was, of course, rejected completely by Israel because it's not a Zionist agenda. Now Israel wants us to become Zionist and accept a Jewish state that is pure and Jewish and so on based on religion, when we are trying to build a state that is pluralistic and diverse and inclusive and democratic. So they're asking us to do something that the world has rejected everywhere else except in Israel. Now, when we say one state, then you have to translate that into policy. You have to find partners for this vision. You have to say, okay, then let's have no borders on historical Palestine. It's all one state, equal rights regardless of your nationality, ethnicity, religious affiliation, whatever. And this is something that I said would de-Zionize Israel, and something that has very few takers within Israel. There are some, but they're few. And it's going to take a long time. How do you curb Israeli violations till you get to that state where you can have one state between the river and the sea, as we say, for all the people living there on the basis of equality, parity, and so on? It's very difficult, because this is something that Israel is fighting against with all its might. It wants, as we say, the geography without the demography. wants the land but doesn't want the people. Some of them say we can give them civil rights maybe, but we can't give them political rights.
Or economic.
Or economic rights.
Let's have a few questions. Like this. Okay, very many. So let's keep it short. Let's begin here.
Dr. Ashrawi, thank you so much for your speech. May I turn the focus to domestic Palestinian politics? I mean, the time is long overdue for Palestinian elections, both parliamentary and presidential elections. There was an agreement between Fatah and Hamas in 2014 about reconciliation, the Shati agreement. It's also long overdue. Hamas is now presenting its new document, probably aiming at being more appealing to Egypt, one can imagine.
Yes.
But my question is, do the factions here, Fatah and Hamas, really want reconciliation? And where is the political movement going among Palestinians?
It's such a big question. I
That's-
think you need to address it
quite,
immediately.
it's an accurate. Really, we do have. I mean, internally, the situation is quite disturbing actually, and isn't very comfortable because the rift between Fatah and Hamas, or the PLO factions and Hamas, Fatah being the largest, of course, movement, and Hamas, is a rift that has been very detrimental to to the Palestinian cause, Palestinian presentation, even Palestinian rights. Gaza is still under occupation, but it's under siege. And it's a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. And it is controlled by Hamas exclusively. And Hamas, as you know, is not very respectful of human rights or women's rights. So in addition to economic deprivation and so on, in addition to the siege by Israel, and daily you have incursions and shooting and killing and so on in Gaza, you also have a Palestinian system that is not respectful of the rights of the Palestinians. And you also have intervention by other countries, external sources. It's not entirely purely domestic. Again, and the same thing in the West Bank. You have the PLO factions and Fatah, and somehow both sides seem to have settled into a system of, I don't want to say privilege, I have very few privileges under the situation, but a system of control, of benefits, of power, and so on. And it's very hard to find either side wanting to relinquish this. Now, the agreements go back to 2005, even before the division, before the rift, the first Cairo agreement. Then we had 2010, 2011 agreement, and 2014, the Shati agreement. We've had a series of agreements. We don't need any new agreements. What we need is for people not to meddle, external forces not to meddle, and to allow us to have our own reconciliation. When the Americans think that and have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, it means you're telling everybody you cannot come to an agreement with Hamas. There's a price to be paid. When other countries like Turkey or Qatar or whatever tell Hamas that hold on and we'll get you recognition and legitimacy and so on, and you can maintain your control over Gaza, or the Muslim Brotherhood thinks that can be controlled, that doesn't encourage Hamas to come to a deal. So what we need to do is to remove all these factors that are undermining the chances of a deal, including a sense of privilege also by either side, and the fact that it is in the Palestinians' best interest to have elections. That's the only way. National elections, you need legislative, you need presidential, but you need also the National Council elections, and you need to upgrade and reform the PLO as the political representative address for all the Palestinian people. And for it to be genuinely representative, Hamas has to be part of it. Jihad Islami has to be part of it, because they are parts of our political reality. And so people who want to abide by the law, to dissent by nonviolent means, have the full right to disagree, to dissent in accordance with the law and peacefully. That's the only way to move forward and to empower ourselves internally. Now we saw that Hamas has changed its its charter in some ways, trying to distance itself a bit from the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to say it's a national movement within Palestine. It is not an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It has tried to say it will accept the 67 boundaries for the Palestinian state and so on, which is a signal that we are willing to play by international rules. I hope that signal is picked up and that it is followed through, in the sense that we cannot afford to have any part of our political system be treated as a pariah or be kept outside, because the more you exclude people, the more extreme and violent they become. They have to be part of our system, but within a democratic approach, and based on a rule of law and the recognition of equal rights. It's not easy. I can tell you it's not easy, because under occupation and with so many different factors involved, and with Israel being very happy with the rift and maintaining this rift and translating it also into a territorial divide, it's very hard to really achieve genuine reconciliation. But I think we are inventive enough, and we should have the political will and determination to achieve this.
Part of leadership is picking up the signals when they appear.
Yes.
Here?
Hi.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Hammarberg. I actually had the same question as the one posed. And I noticed that you said that the Hamas document that they just published is a signal, and that you hope that it will be picked up. What would be the more clear advice to Swedish actors or European actors when it comes to how this signal should be picked up? Basically that. Anything you also would like to say about the need for reform of the PLO structure and what could be done there? And is there any role that European countries could play in order to encourage something to happen when it comes to that?
Yes.
Can I recognize just a few more questions? Can you handle that? No. You want to respond?
Well, it's easier for me because then I
Yes.
forget what
All
the
right,
questions
please. Sorry.
were, and then I try to merge them all together, but I want to recognize individual questions anyway. Yes, it is a signal. Europe has come out openly asking for reconciliation and reunification. That's its position. Even though there are some who consider Hamas a terrorist organization, it's the US that really has designated it as terrorist organization. And it's a situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because when we were approaching the Shattah agreement, what did Netanyahu say? He made his choice. They said, Abu Mazen has chosen terrorism and to talk to Hamas and negotiate with Hamas rather than negotiate with us. As though, these are the choices, He's negotiating with his own people. Anyway, so, and of course, there are voices who understand, Sweden understands, that reconciliation and the repair of a democratic system is very important for Palestinian empowerment and the presentation of the Palestinian cause globally. And so they have no problems pushing for reconciliation. The thing is, they had preconditions, as you know, the European conditions on recognition of Hamas and reconciliation having to do with the renunciation of violence, acceptance of the PLO agenda, and so on and so on. So Hamas is moving in that direction. But in some ways, when you put conditions that can be demeaning, you are telling the other side, don't accept them, because we are imposing on you things that would eradicate your differences, as though you expect the Palestinian people to be monolithic, to all believe in the same thing, to all have the same party. What would distinguish Hamas from Fatah, for example, if they have the same political agenda? The problem is, of course, Hamas is more ideological, religious than the more secular parties in Palestine. So the Swedes can really push, not just for reconciliation, for genuine democratic elections. We need that in Palestine, across the board. And then they will recognize the results of elections, not what happened in 2006 when we had elections. Hamas was elected due to a variety of reasons, and then everybody was punished. Everybody. We were placed under sanctions, the cooperation agreements were frozen, there was no funding, we ended up without salaries for all the civil service, all the security, because the Palestinians elected the wrong government, while Israel has been busy violating international law since the beginning, and nobody ever placed it under sanctions. But we were placed under sanctions for having an election that did not produce the results other people wanted. So that's the thing. But in terms of reform, yes, I think the PLO needs serious reform. It needs structural, institutional reform. It needs reactivation. It needs expansion to include everybody to be genuinely representative. Well, what happened is that since the signing of the DOP, and since the PLO formed the PA as an arm of the PLO to carry out functions and to deliver services and to build institutions under occupation, because we still are, there was a concerted effort by the international community to gradually weaken the PLO and to strengthen the PA at the expense of the PLO. Because the PLO represents, to the Palestinians, it's a major accomplishment. It represents the Palestinian national identity, the historical national struggle. It is the all-encompassing political address. It is the only body empowered to take political decisions or to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinian people everywhere. And as such, there was a real attempt to get rid of the PLO. So originally it was said that the PLO would sign the agreements on behalf of the PA, because the PLO formed the PA in order to run the lives of the people for the interim, for the transitional period, and to deliver services. Instead, gradually, they started, for example, the PA signing on behalf of the PLO. They reversed the whole thing. And they kept weakening the PLO to the point where there are no international agreements with the PLO. They are all with the PA, which is amazing. And that has wreaked havoc in Palestinian political life. The only safety net we have is the PLO. The PA is at the mercy of Israel. They can, withhold our money, they can besiege us, they can destroy the institutions, and they're busy, strangling the PA. But the PLO has to be, the all-encompassing representative body, and we need elections for the PLO. We need elections, yes, domestically for the Legislative Council, which should be part of the PNC, the National Council. We need presidential elections. They're long overdue. And we need to be able to reactivate the institutions of the PLO and to bring in women, especially young women, and youth. We need the spirit. Frankly speaking, I'm not going to insult the PLO anymore, but I believe that the PLO is really quite geriatric and set in its ways. We need youth, we need the spirit of youth, we need the foresight, we need the energy, we need the willingness to deal with a contemporary world that is different from the language, the ossified language of the 1960s, 70s, and so on. So that has to be done. We know what needs to be done. What we need to do is do it. And people have to make room. And we have to empower the young and women, and we have to form coalitions, and we have to form support systems for that.
Thank you very much. Can you deal with one more question before we need to move on?
Yes.
Please.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ashrawi, for this presentation. My name is Ulf Karlsson. Some less than 50 years ago, the late Swedish Parliament took a bold step to invite Yasser Arafat to speak in front of the UN General Assembly in Geneva. I think to invite Dr. Ashrawi here is a wise step to take. And I'd like to ask you, what would be an equally bold step to take today for Swedish politicians in comparison to the invitation that Olof Palme extended to Yasser Arafat? Is there such an opportunity, and what would that step be?
Well, you did something really significant in terms of the recognition of Palestine, because that recognition sent a clear signal that you believe in the two-state solution. You cannot just deal with Israel or recognize Israel. You have to recognize Palestine and, again, empower Palestine to be an equal player globally and to define the Palestinian territory as occupied, which Israel is. I mean, the term occupation is being dropped from the global lexicon as though occupation doesn't exist. This is Israel, or disputed territory. That you have done, and what you can do is pursue this further and be a voice within the EU and within the world. Now that Sweden is a member of the Security Council for a while, it's important that Sweden continue to stand up to attempts at intimidation, attempts at catering and pandering to Israel, because now Israel is on a major campaign by claiming, Nikki Haley says this is all anti-Israeli, just by being Palestinian or by recognizing Palestinian identity, you are being anti-Israeli. And the mere fact of our existence bothers her, Nikki Haley. So anyway, so we need voices like Margot Wallström and the Security Council. We need, again, we need the feminist system that you set up here to be able to empower women. But I think the one thing that Europe as a whole should do is to hold Israel to account. If there's no accountability for Israel, if there's no price to be paid, as I said earlier, it will persist. The thing is, Israel decides to punish countries that decide to hold it accountable, or decide even to talk to people within Israel who do not follow the major line of the government. We were thinking it is time for economic sanctions, for example. Not just labeling products, not just the guidelines, but no cooperation agreements and so on. Now, the thing is, you have to have a critical mass to do that. You have to have the EU do that. Sweden can do it alone, but it's not enough. Because within the EU, whether it's the association agreement, the neighborhood agreement, or Europe 2020, Horizon 2020 agreements, or whatever, Israel has certainly preferential treatment and has quite a bit of support from Europe. And unless that is affected, unless Europe implements its own legislation, Israel isn't going to bother if people just criticize it. It doesn't matter. That criticism has to be followed. I don't know of any dramatic step that can be taken beyond what is taken, but perhaps by maintaining this course of speaking truth to power, of articulating the Palestinian message, of challenging within Europe and outside the global system to do what is right, to obey its own laws, to respect its own human rights, international humanitarian law and international law. Otherwise, it's chaos, and Israel will persist. So that's all I can say.
Thank you. And seldom has the need of speaking truth to power been so opposite at this time. Thank you for being with us and helping us to understand. Thank you for helping us talk about these issues in a more direct way. The cause of Palestine, an independent, secure, recognized democratic state is not lost. Thank you for speaking to our audience and to another audience through the camera. You're always welcome in Sweden, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.